Well, hey everybody, welcome to our Expert for Authors Q&A. Today, we are hanging with a molecular anthropologist, Meredith Houston. I am so excited that you are here, and you're actually an author as well, so you know exactly what we're talking about today. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself to us?
Yeah, no, totally. So I am a professor of anthropology with a specialty in ancient DNA. So that basically means DNA that's degraded, that's old, that's been kind of been through some times. And this is going to focus, on a variety of different areas, both forensics. So I do some work with that in forensic DNA and all that sort of good stuff, as well as with populations in Mexico. So that's where I also spend some time. But I also teach classes like in biology and human variation and human evolution too, if you're interested in Neanderthals or anything along those lines. So kind of do a breadth of things. That's a fun part of being a professor these days. So you don't tend to just stick to one thing, but those are my general areas where I know more than your average person.
And I'm so excited. You're actually working with me on one of my books, and you are doing so dang well over on TikTok educating people too. So, guys, when you're done, head on over to Meredith's TikTok because she's breaking down all sorts of great things that you might actually want to imply in your story or kind of implement into what you are creating inside of your novels. So, I want to jump in and I want to get those questions asked. If you're joining us for the live stream, hello, go ahead and drop your questions into the chat box. This will be on replay over on YouTube, and you all are welcome to leave more questions there. We'll be monitoring them on the YouTube replay as well as we continue our Experts for Authors series. And Meredith, I want to talk a little bit about your job specifications. So what do we need to know when it comes to your job?
That's a great question. And honestly, it kind of extends to like some broader things that I see people struggle with sometimes. And that is like what a professor is these days, right? So if you are at a university, this is going to then mean that for most of your instructors are going to have a PhD. So going to be a very few lecturers who may not. So I got my PhD at the University of California at Davis in anthropology with a specialty in ancient DNA. And so that's pretty typical. Though occasionally you do see people like at community colleges who may be teaching with a master's degree, which is kind of like the PhD, master's, bachelor's. That's kind of how that works. In case you may not generally know that, that's one of those things that's sometimes out there, sometimes not. So in terms of that, that's what I have. And then I have a bunch of experience working in laboratories. So I did my undergraduate degree actually in archaeology, spent a year doing archaeology for hire. So I have that as a background too.
Okay.
I have this really strange, like massive, weird background. But then I spent a couple years working in a molecular lab, so doing basically lab work, bench work is what it's referred to. And so I have a lot of experience with pipetting, which is basically just moving small amounts of usually clear liquid from one little tube to another little tube. And yeah, those are some of my background things. For in terms of teaching, really for most professors, it's one of those things you learn on the fly. Not exactly the best thing, but it's definitely something that some of us really enjoy more than others, in case anybody ever wonders. But yeah, professordom is kind of a crazy place right these days, especially with COVID. But you tend to having kind of this weird, busy, strange schedule. So.
That's so interesting. And I really want to break down what that kind of looks like for you because you are educating. So is this more along the lines of like standing in a classroom and actually lecturing, or is it more along the lines of getting people in the lab and doing things? Like, what does this look like?
That's a totally great question because actually it's both. So I do teach classes, right? So I usually teach 2 to 3 a semester. And I'll teach like one during the summer. And right now that's a little bit different. Like looks a little funky, right? I'm teaching online or on Zoom. So I do that, and that is some lecturing, some discussion, some facilitating of student learning, that sort of fun, like direct hands-on stuff that sounds or looks probably pretty familiar. I don't ever use a podium, but that would be the idea that you should get. But also I do a ton of hands-on work. So I often have undergraduate and graduate interns and graduate students who I am training in laboratory skills. So, a few hours of my week, if not more, I'll be in there being like, okay, this is how we do this process. We're going to get DNA out of this, and this is how we do it. So lots of hands-on and lots of of both, I guess. So very busy.
And you mentioned that you work with interns. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I feel like that's one of those things that authors are really going to lean into with the internships.
Right. Yeah. No, internships are great. And I highly recommend them, especially if you're an undergraduate, right? Do some internships. You probably won't get paid. I don't usually pay mine. I'll be honest. Sometimes you can find them that are. Usually you have to go in with some experience though. So that's the trick. But those internships then are great for coming in, spending like a couple hours a week or less, depending, where basically I can just walk you through things or you can shadow me. So I've definitely done that quite a bit. I've had some friends, come in who are authors or other people, and they just, are able to really learn the ropes and to see actually what it looks like on the ground. And, this is one of my favorite things. I am kind of in the middle of nowhere in Montana, but for those who are interested, I do teach a summer course that actually is a 3-week-long intensive for people who are interested in learning about anthropological or forensic DNA, and I run you through everything. So anybody who might ever be like, oh, I really, really need to know the nitty-gritty of this for a book, that's a really good option.
I feel like at some point people are going to kind of tap you and be like, can we do this digitally? Can we do it over Zoom?
I know, we'd be like, oh, can I strap a camera to my forehead? I thought about that. I'm like, so you can because you have to watch me do things with my hands, and it's so hard.
We're gonna get you a GoPro and just attach and go. I love it.
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna be like, all right, in my total body condom, right? My whole get up where I'm I have a tie back on, this is a hood and a hairnet and a face mask, and I'm literally head to toe covered. And I'm I just have a little headband with a camera.
I love it. I feel like that would make a really fun TikTok series, not only to see it, but to see you in the getup. That would be fun. I'm here for that.
I'll just see if I can borrow my brother's GoPro or something like that.
Yes. Oh, please do. I love it. I love it so much. Hey, if you're joining us while we are live, go ahead and drop your questions. We're going to get those answered in just a couple of minutes. We had some questions come in early that we're going to take a look at as well. But if you are in our Facebook group, I want to quickly remind you, in the caption for today's live stream, there's a link. If you click it, that gives Facebook permission to share your name. So when we pull you and your comment up on screen, we know who you are so we can chat directly with you. So please make sure you do that if you have not already. And we're going to get those questions answered. And Meredith, this has been incredible information so far. I'm so excited to continue. And I want to jump in and talk about what a typical day looks like for you.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm not a morning person. I'm going to be really honest. But yeah, I'm up, 7-ish and attempting then to drink enough tea to get myself moving. So, there's usually a few buckets of that. However, I spend my morning usually until about 9 o'clock answering emails. The sheer amount of email I get, I'm sure you could understand this, is nuts. Yeah, exactly. It's insane. There are days when I'm just oh my gosh, I will never get through this. I could literally spend all 8 hours of my workday on email. But anyhow, so I usually spend as much time as I can, to putting out the fires, as I refer to it. I usually then usually do that at home. I'm lucky enough to live 4 or 5 blocks from my office, which is really nice. We moved about a year ago to specifically kind of take advantage of that. So usually I'm on my bike, headed to work in my office at that point. And then I'll spend the morning editing stuff for students or in the lab. So just it kind of depends on my day. And usually I'm either training somebody or attempting to get some samples run. Try to have lunch. That doesn't always happen. I'm awful at self-care at work. Can be really fair there. But usually then in the afternoons I teach either a lecture or hold office hours or things like that. So I spend a lot of time on Zoom. There's always a meeting scattered somewhere in there as well, if not 3 meetings or more. So I'm usually kind of bouncing around from things. I'm dealing with students coming into my office or people that are, kind of needing things or information. There's always that last minute, oh, I need this form signed, sort of thing. So there's, I call it the pinball effect, where it's you're okay, jumping from one thing to the other. And it's a constant game of attempting to, knock down all the things. I don't know what is the goal of pinball? Get the most points. That's what it feels like.
Like that.
I know, where I'm This may not be the best analogy, but that's what it feels like.
I get it though.
Yeah. And I'll be honest, my workday often extends well into the evening. And I may come home, go for a run, do that sort of thing, try to take care of my puppies, and my husband. Yeah, I'll usually end up either editing something or working on a chapter or something along those lines. Not even writing related, like just work related well into the evening. So, and that's weekends too. It's a never ending job.
So with that in mind, let me ask you, because you do work with interns, you do have people around you that can kind of help with some things. What are just a couple of the things that you can hand off without you having to be the one overseeing everything?
Right. My ultimate goal is always to have an intern get to the point where I can be like, I need you to do this. And then be like, do it. And it happens usually towards the end of the semester. And then usually they go off and use those skills that I've taught them and get a job, which is totally fair because theoretically they are using or getting those skills with me to do that.
Uh-huh.
It's like, oh, that was what I was hoping for you to do for me. But it's fine. It totally is fine. So yeah, there's a lot of things that I do try to hand off with some of my more senior graduate students. When they are fully trained, I can hand stuff off to them. And that's great. I super appreciate it. And try to get everybody to that point really, so that I can just kind of be like, go for it. I don't need to be there. And it's a great blessing when that totally happens and falls into place. It does not happen frequently enough of late. I don't know why. It's probably COVID. Yeah. Something along those lines.
Could be. That could be it. And I want to ask, because I know you mentioned that you spend a lot of time emailing out and responding to emails, and we all know how much fun that is. So without going too into detail, what types of emails are you doing? Because I know you have to talk to a lot of different people, different companies. You have a lot of explanation stuff that you have to do. So just kind of like brief overview, should somebody be writing a scene where someone like you is answering a bunch of emails, just to kind of throw things in there.
Yeah, absolutely. So probably, gosh, the one I get the most is like, please explain to me what this portion of the class assignment is about. Or, I need an extension on this for a class assignment. Depending on how big my classes are, that happens more or less frequently. Bigger classes, you always end up with people who are like, if you'd read the syllabus, you would not. But that's okay. So, I definitely get a lot of individuals with just like basic questions. So those are really quick to knock out, but they're also kind of like, you didn't need to email me. But definitely a whole bunch of other stuff. I am co-chair of my department, which means I also have a lot of like people applying for graduation that I have to sign off on, or departmental forms like for enrollment or information that is needed for accreditation or all that sort of stuff. So an ungodly amount of paperwork. So I sometimes I'm like, what this is literally going to just go in a file someplace. I don't know why I'm wasting my time, but
paperwork, I despise it. So I'm glad you're there with me.
Yeah. So not just kind of, it's unbelievably awful.
It is. Is there any specific type of paperwork we should be aware of, or just like general paperwork?
That's a good question. Probably just in general. I mean, everything's a little bit different depending on the school structure. So, like some places, you're always going to have, different things with how their accreditation works, how they communicate with like the next level up in administration, all that sort of good stuff. But definitely like the student email ones where it's like, that was explained in the email and the video I posted and in the lecture. Those are constant. I don't know what it is, but that's fine. It's fair. I know. I'd rather people ask me than be confused sometimes.
As a former teacher, I feel this on a very deep level. So
exactly.
Apologies for that. Oh gosh, I love it. And I want to switch gears just a little bit because I have a question that I love asking my experts, and it's all about what the entertainment industry gets wrong about your job. So what do we need to know when we're watching those TV shows and those movies and we're reading those books? Like, what is it that just drives you crazy because it's so off base?
Oh my gosh. There's There's so much. Let me start with the forensic ones, okay? Because those are probably the ones that bug me the most. And that is like if you're watching CSI or Bones, even though Bones is a tiny bit better, or like I don't know, anything pretty much other than Forensic Files, which is actually pretty decent because it's like more documentary style. Man, the idea that you can tell so much from like somebody's foot that you found on, you know, a riverbank. I mean, it's constantly just like, oh my gosh, that no, you can't tell that. Sorry. Like there's just absolutely no way. You can maybe make a guess. Sometimes people can make guesses and they tend to like build off of those guesses, and that has horrific consequences in terms of forensic identification or anything like that. But like if you were to find a skeleton, first of all, if you are not a cop, you need to call the cops. If you find a skeleton, number one, please do that. You would be surprised how many people end up bringing things to my office. They're like, hey, look what we found in grandma's backyard. And it's like a human skull. And I'm like, what? No, I'm not even kidding you. This has happened like 5 times in the last 2 years.
What?
I know, I'm not even joking. I'll just like, anyhow,
wow.
the cops, you're not going to get in trouble or anything like that. You just tell them honestly what happened. They're not going to think you murdered somebody. Like this does happen. There's a precedent for it. But yeah, like people often like on those shows misrepresent what you can actually learn from somebody's head or from their arm or foot, whatever you're going to find. Most of the time, you're going to be real lucky from just looking at something that you might be able to tell what biological sex they were, which bear in mind is like totally different from their gender or their sexual identity, etc. So, you know, there's that. But yeah, like you might be able to get that information from like a femur, your thigh bone. You can probably get it with some degree of accuracy from the crania, your head. But, you know, that's about it. Like there's some just basic information. Now, I mean, if you had somebody test the DNA on that, you might get a lot more information about their ancestry and, you know, biological sex, other things that might be helpful. But, you know, there's just a whole lot of probability involved. And so many of those shows just completely do not represent that, which, okay, I get it. It doesn't make as good a show and drama, but like, it also misrepresents that to like the whole of all of everybody, yeah. Which really interesting research that shows that also then biases when you have like a jury trial. People think that that's going to be really true and they don't realize the actual science behind it. And that gets kind of screwed up. So
that makes a lot of sense. Wow, that's right. Okay, so y'all take note of that one. That's important. And you actually did a really good TikTok the other day where you were talking about where to actually be finding DNA in a body that maybe you don't have all of the potential pieces of. So can you kind of just like real quick, because I love this piece of information. Where's the best place to find it?
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, you can potentially get DNA out of most bone, right? But if it's old and if it's got some problems or it's been underwater or things like that, there are places you should target that are going to have the best chances. And that's actually going to be like the inner ear bones, part of your petrous, which is going to be on your temporal bone, which is like on your temple, right? And so you can actually drill in there with a very thin little, I use a dental drill bit actually, it was kind of random, but you can get a little bit of powdered bone out of like the inner ear bones off the crania and use that. And that's actually got some of the highest concentration of DNA that we know of off the body. The other place would be your teeth. So if you get tooth roots, you can actually get really good DNA out of there. And actually some really cool recent research has also shown that that's a good spot to go if a person had an infection. You might be able to pick up the DNA from like the bacteria that they might have had an infection from that tooth root as well. Not so much from the ear, but definitely from the teeth. So some cool stuff that you can do. This is also something that's like not well known, weirdly across like even people in my field. So because I have to charge for people to do like their DNA off of skeletons we find here in Montana, and there's a place that will do it for free in Texas. Often, which I totally understand, like our cops will send stuff down to Texas to have them do it for free. And I've watched them try to pull DNA off of like the weirdest spots. One of our crania came back and had like a giant cut piece out of its forehead. And I was like, That's like the worst spot to go. So
Wow.
I actually have a graduate student who's currently working on like a heat map of like everything down from the head. Where should you sample DNA? And because we actually really don't know, like once you get out of those two regions, your teeth and your inner ear bones, where's a good spot? And so we're actually kind of trying to map that out a little bit more accurately. So
Wow. That's so fancy. I love it. Okay, so I want to know, because I know you mentioned that the cops have a lot of questions and they have to send things away to Texas, but you also do a little bit of this. So how often do you end up working on these different cases?
Every once in a while. They're actually usually handled by more of my department as a whole. So we actually have like the forensic wing of the anthropology department, and there's a couple of other faculty members who this is, when they get called out to do this sort of thing, they're often the first line of defense, and then I end up doing it if they can. Because I am more of the lab tech, right? Like I'm the person who's like, yes, you send me the samples once you found them. However, I have been out on, multiple times. I don't know, 10-ish cases here where we've had like, all right, let's work. We know somebody died in these woods. We're going to go try to find them. So that gets tricky and difficult. And it's also really fun if you're like me.
Well, I think it's safe to say that all writers are like, let's talk about serial killers and let's talk about all this stuff. Like, I feel like that's just us. We get that.
So true. I will admit to like not totally following like the serial killer thing, but I don't know how many people, that is literally the first question I get. Oh, so-and-so serial killer. And I'm like, okay, cool. They're a sociopath, right? Or like, but no, it extends to my students too. Like honestly, people in my classes, that's like their favorite topic to write on. Like, oh, so-and-so serial killer. It's all good.
That's so funny. I love it. So what is the process like when you do get involved in these cases? How do they contact you? What are the steps that they take? Like, what does this look like?
Usually we have a contact that is going to be either the coroner or the crime lab. So Missoula has a crime lab here in town that actually services most of the state. And that's been changing a little bit recently. Too much detail. Anyhow, so what they will do then is if they get skeletonized remains, that's where our department comes in. So forensic anthropologists tend to really just work with the skeleton. If there's fleshy bits, occasionally we will do some stuff. But generally, if they find a fresh body, cops and the coroner and crime lab and that sort of thing. But as soon as you get stuff that's been around a while, that's where we come in. So usually we'll get a call. Or a local police department will reach out. So I often get messages from, somebody from a detective from different police stations around Montana, occasionally into Idaho, that will then ask, oh, hey, we've got something that's going on, or we need an identification. I'll be honest, at least half the time it's a deer. It's not even a human. They're like, oh yeah, hey, we found this thing. We need to make sure it's not a human bone. And they'll send me a picture and I'll be like, it has a horn. I'm afraid it's probably not human.
That's pretty bad.
Yeah, it's actually pretty hilarious. Somebody has a cartoon up in the lab where that's the joke. Yeah. But yeah, so that's usually what will end up happening. We'll coordinate then with local law enforcement and attempt to then work either with finding individuals, excavation occasionally as well. And if those remains have already been found and they're kind of collected and brought in, like we're sent to the crime lab here, then we can take custody of those and then do what's known as like a case report, a forensic case report, which will then try to analyze whatever's there. Sometimes it's a pretty full skeleton. More often than not, it's like a foot or something like that. And attempt to then build as much information off of that. So if you do have enough of it, you can determine things like biological sex. You can get some at ancestry. You can get a little bit at stature. So like how tall they were, things like that. And a few extra additional things, if they have obvious broken bones or other conditions that, then you can use to build a little bit of information about what may have led to death. Now, we are never allowed to actually say what caused death. We have to allow for the medical examiner to do that. That's their job. They're the official people, but we can kind of point things out and be like, hey, this person obviously had cancer. Like, look at these lesions on their bones. And then that can get called by, somebody with a medical degree. So.
Fun. We always love being very official about everything.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You have to be in this day and age, and especially because everything, if it does go to court, you have to make sure that you've done everything correctly. Like the worst fear for anybody, like, oh my gosh, you missed something giant, or you called something wrong, and then it goes to court and somebody goes free, or somebody who wasn't guilty goes to jail. There's all sorts of massive ramifications for what can happen. Now, most of the stuff we want to, work on here is, it's a cold case. I've got a guy in my right now who's just found in the river. We don't know who he was. It's not really pressing because we don't know, but that sort of thing.
Okay. When you do these different cases, do you have to go to court, or is that like somebody else in your department, or like, what does that look like?
I haven't personally, so I'm counting myself lucky on that. But we do have somebody else in the department who has, and actually several people that have had to go in and testify in court. So basically, tell what they did, show how they did it, and kind of like back that up, and then answer questions that might arise from that. How accurate is this, and that sort of thing. So it doesn't happen frequently, but also bear in mind, that we're in Montana. There's not that many people. There's more murders than one might think for living in Montana. But it definitely, can happen, but it's not as frequent as maybe if we lived someplace more populous. So.
That makes sense. That does make a lot of sense. If you're joining us live and you've got questions, now is a great time to drop those. We're going to get those answered in just a moment. And if you're on the replay, don't worry. We're going to be monitoring the questions as well. And we're definitely going to have Meredith back. So don't worry. It's happening. I'm not giving her the option. We're friends. She's going to jump in on this one, but we will get to your questions as soon as possible. And Meredith, I know that entertainment industry gets a lot of things wrong. So anything else we need to cover before we move on?
Let me see. There's so many. I'm going to try and keep this to like a minimum. I saw this article the other day and it made me giggle. And it was like, why does Hollywood think that all archaeologists are hot? And I was like, if you think about like Laura Croft or Indiana Jones and all these like beautiful people. And I'm like, oh, I know a lot of archaeologists. Anyhow, there's definitely some good looking ones out there, but that is a stereotype right there. Not to like dog on any of my friends. I totally think there's some beautiful people and they're very good humans, but yeah, that's one of those random things. Also it totally glamorizes archaeology and it is not like that. And it's usually, digging in a hole very carefully with a brush and for hours and hours a day, which is totally fine and super fun for some individuals. I mean, I really enjoyed it, but yeah, it's all good. Anyhow, I could go on for quite a while, so I'll just keep it at that. That one made me laugh the other day, though.
That actually brings me to another question. When you're in holes digging with tools, I want to talk about some of the tools of your trade. So what kind of big things do we need to be Googling when we're done with this conversation? Just kind of give us some of like the big things, the keywords that we need to be researching.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, totally. So if you are... I'm just going to stick to the DNA aspect of this. Not so much in archaeology, although that's really an interesting whole other thing. So if I were like given something from a crime scene that I was attempting to analyze the DNA from, what I would want is like a drill of some kind. I usually use a dental drill, so you can maybe do a little bit of Googling on that. As well as kind of the environment. And I think that's one of the things that is overlooked in a lot of books as well. And they don't realize, like I have to have a pretty sterile environment to make sure that I'm only getting DNA from the sample and like not from me or from the detective or anybody else that might have touched or sneezed or touched the sample. So any of that sort of stuff. The other things, of course, that are tools of my trade are going to be pipettes. So these are going to be I wish I had one I could show you. But basically like kind of like a long rod, right? That has a mechanism in it that allows you to measure very specific small amounts of liquid, up to large amounts too. But basically that's going to help you then create the chemical reactions that will both extract the DNA from the sample. So separate the DNA from all the rest of it. But it'll also allow for me to create the downstream, like I've got the DNA out, now I'm going to do these other extractions and other methods that are going to allow for me to pick out the parts of the DNA that I want. And I do that in a chemical way. So your pipettes are going to be vital for all of that, and kind of understanding how they work, what you do with them, how you have tips and waste and all that sort of good stuff would be really, really useful to know. Again, I should totally make a TikTok on this. Okay, and then beyond that, the next one is going to be your thermocycler. That's probably one of the biggest tools that I use regularly for everything from just like keeping something at a specific temperature so that the chemical reaction can happen, but also to do things like polymerase chain reaction, abbreviated as PCR. Sounds really complicated, but really is not. It's actually just making a whole bunch of copies of DNA of a very specific portion of the DNA that you're interested in. So for those forensic places in the genome that people want to look at for markers that we're using for comparison, we amplify those with PCR. And I would do that on a thermocycler. And I have seen that word get used erroneously in multiple books where people are trying to sound like they know what they're talking about. And I was like, Stephanie Meyer screws this up in one of hers, just to drop a name. If anybody can find that one. I actually really enjoyed her book, The Chemist, I think is what it's called, like that more recent one that she put out. And I was reading that part and I was like, wait. You just said that did what? So anyhow, watch out on that one. It's basically just a machine that basically moves the temperatures up and down. It doesn't do anything beyond that, but it does help us then to create this chemical reaction that copies DNA. So off the top of my head, those are some of the biggies that I would say, watch out for. Google, make sure you understand. Ask me. I'm more than happy to talk about it, about, how these different sort of tools of the trade actually work. So
I love it. And of course, make sure you're paying attention to TikTok because those are coming.
Yes. Yeah, I know. I'm going to have to figure out, seriously, borrow my brother's GoPro.
You should. I'm excited to see it. I just want you to strap your phone to your head and take me on a live stream tour all day. I just want it to happen.
Oh my gosh. I know. I was like, I did think about that. And I was like, I don't really know how I would do that without totally probably like dropping it someplace.
I can see that. I can see it ending badly.
Right.
Yeah. Would be fun for me though. I'm definitely here for watching that.
I know. I definitely probably get more hits because it would be funny. But
that's true. Well, there you go. That's how to grow your numbers. I love it. Okay. Is there anything else we need to know before we jump into questions?
Oh my gosh. I didn't even talk about my work in Mexico.
Let's do that. Tell us quick.
Real quick. So I tend to look at like really old populations, like we're talking like 1,000 or so years ago. I'm looking at like how people moved around, right? So I work at some big sites down in like Chihuahua, Mexico, with like it's known as Paquime, if anybody wants to Google it. That's a super fun one. So I kind of look at like, all right, it used to be a tiny village and then it got into this really big city. Like, what happened? Why did people do that? And so that's actually some of my more like strictly anthropological work where I'm using DNA to try to trace people from early times to late times and kind of like, was there a bunch of people that moved in? Were there more individuals that moved out? What happened? So that's kind of more of my typical workload. So.
See, I love that kind of thing. Like, I just love talking all the details. I could sit and listen to your stories all day on that one.
I like to talk a lot in case that's not obvious. So.
That's why we hang out, though. I get all the good stories behind the scenes. It makes me happy.
Good stuff. Totally.
Danielle is in our comments, and she would like to know, what is the oldest set of remains that you've worked on?
Oh my gosh. Let's see here. Oldest. That's a really, really good question. Probably about 2,000 years, roughly. I know I have friends that have worked on like Neanderthal things, right? They're like 30,000 or 50,000 years old. And 2,000 is still old, right? but I have a very weird anthropological view of old these days, which is like 2000 is not really that much. And so, yeah, that's probably, I think that's the oldest stuff that I personally have like touched and worked with. So
on a related note, what's the most unique set of remains that you've worked on?
oh gosh, shoot. I don't know if I can tell that story because I think it's still
Okay.
I have a real fun one. That's a future story.
Yay. Next time.
Really cool.
Next time we do this, I'm excited to hear it.
Yeah.
That's awesome. We did have some questions come in, and they would like to know, what was your first experience seeing a dead person or a skeleton, and how did that make you feel?
Oh yeah. No, I always, I guess, get surprised that people are kind of like, oh, a dead person. And I recognize there's some cultural aspects of that too, right? Like some people, different populations around the world have much different views of death. I grew up on a ranch, right? Like, so death was a thing. So, there's just dead things that happen occasionally. We had kind of a couple of acres set off way back in the back of the property that was a wildlife area. And I remember finding dead things back there, or being really interested in owl pellets because like you could pull little bones out of them. And I was very much that nerdy child. In terms of like a real actual dead person skeleton, I think I was an undergrad. And I just remember being fascinated more than scared. I think, that's a very personal reaction, and I totally can respect how individuals like see that and deal with it personally. But for me, it's a skeleton. Like the person's no longer there, and in my estimation. And I, again, recognize totally that there's a lot of different views and feelings on that. So for me, it's just kind of an interesting legacy that they left behind that we can actually learn a little bit about them from. And I think that really intrigued me quite a bit from a very, very young age, and then building with the educational tract that I took. So.
Okay, so then I have to know, because you do work with a lot of skeletons and you do a lot of research and you learn a lot of things about people, for you personally, what is the most interesting part of that? Like, what is it that drives you to continue to do so?
Oh gosh. I think it's probably like making a connection between something that's very old and modern people today. So I just had an article come out actually like just last week. I've been working on it for a long time, so it feels like it's been out forever, but it hasn't. And we did some work on these remains that had been trafficked. Like they excavated them out of this cave in Texas. It was kind of awful. And I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty details because it's all terrible. But basically, I have my collaborator who tracked them down through all these like crazy avenues of paperwork and dealing with all these interesting situations, and found these individuals that had been looted out of this archaeological site. And I ran some DNA off of them because we were trying to make sure that they were the same individuals from where they came from, and like to tie them together to see if that was possible. And from that have been able to actually trace them to some local Native American individuals within that region. They were actually the people that kind of started the whole thing. And we found out they're actually like directly related to these individuals. And that was probably the coolest thing for me because it really brought them to life, right? Like not literally. It gave me a feeling that like, I'd done some really good with us, like really attempted to collaborate with as much of the Native American community in the region, and then to help get these individuals that they're not back in their hands yet, but we're hoping that that's the path that we can take now that we've kind of really made this solid connection. So that sort of thing really, it made me very happy. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I really enjoy, but for me, that was a recent like, yeah, that was shitty what happened in the past. Let's try to make it at least a touch better today. So
I want to know, as you're doing this, I know this is a process, and it takes a minute to do the things that you have to do to identify people and to make these different inferences from the things that you are researching and studying and learning and connecting. And I know that entertainment tends to fast track these things. So just in general, like how long does this process typically take from, a range?
Right, exactly. Now, if it's just modern DNA, somebody sends me like a cheek swab and does that, and I don't have anything else going on, and I have money to burn, right? Like, like the sample is so important that I've been given money to run it by itself, because usually I have to batch samples together, because then it's cheaper, right?
Okay.
So yeah, it's one of those things that a lot of people don't think about. It's a lot cheaper to run 50 samples together than it is just to do one. So, but if I just do that, it can take me a couple of days. I can get it back, to get their CODIS markers or whatever, really back very fast, or get like a mitochondrial genome, that sort of thing. Now, most of the time, though, I'm going to be really honest, it takes me a couple months, because I have to do the drilling, the extraction, what's known as the library preparation. So like preparing the DNA, then we have to probe for the DNA that we want. And then I have to do that for all the other samples that are going into that batch to help make the costs go down, to make it affordable for like law enforcement to send me stuff. And then I have to send it to the machine. And this machine basically gives me bad gobbledygook that I have to throw back into some sort of order. It's not easy. So it can be, several months. And throwing a pandemic on top of that, it's going to be a lot longer. And that's absolutely something that gets misportrayed. Like, sure, if you had something that was super, super important and you had money to burn, it could go really pretty quick. That's almost never the case.
So then when you're batching this to lower that cost, how many things do you attempt to get in a single batch? And how long does that kind of take to fill up that batch?
Well, it really depends for me on how much help I've got and how much other stuff is going on. So like if I were to do this, and just that's all that I'm doing, I could easily get it done in a few weeks, and get like, a full set of how many I lumped together, right? Which is usually close to 100 or so. I don't get that ripped through. Unfortunately, like I was talking about earlier, there's that email thing, and I have to teach classes, and I have graduate students, and papers to put out, and grants. Oh, don't forget the grants. So it's a little bit more busy than that, unfortunately. But it happens and gets done. I do wish I was faster, and I had, some places where they have more money, they have like people that will do that. Like I could hire someone to be me in the lab for most of the time. I don't have that here. So it's me.
Gotta do all the work. It's one of those important things, all the fun.
I could write the grants. I could write the papers, and somebody else could like pipe out all the stuff.
Yes, there you go. That works.
Yeah, I dream.
Yes, absolute dream. We got another question about what you feel is often overlooked in fiction inside of your field.
The timing definitely is something we've just been talking about. But also things like the complexity of it. I feel like a lot of people don't really realize like it's a lot more difficult than it really looks on TV or even in books. And also, and I did a video on this one as well, it's all based on probability. So the chances of something, and the chances could be very, very slim that it's anybody else, but it's still based on probability. And so most people don't really make that connection that like the math involved behind it really is never saying this sample and this suspect are going to be the exact same person they have to be. No, it's going to be like, there's a really high probability that the sample and the suspect are the same, but it's not always 100% ever. And I think that gets totally glazed over or misconstrued by all kinds of media, let alone actually like in court and stuff like that. That's another one of those things that gets misportrayed so frequently that people think that that's actually like how it works, and it messes with juries.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's important to know.
It really is important to know. All right, we are wrapping up for today. Any final thoughts that we need to be aware of as we are writing anything inside of your field into our stories?
Ask me if you have questions. I'm super happy to help. I totally do this all the time. Don't hesitate to Google, and spend a little time making sure that you've got it right, because I'm going to be really honest. Like as soon as I read somebody messing up, I I can talk, messing up Thermocycler or whatever like that, I'm probably going to be like, I don't really trust the rest of your book. So just one of those things. It's not hard to do. There's totally tons of resources out there. And if you get really stuck, gloss over it. Don't talk about the details.
That's a great tip. I feel like that is the most important tip that we can walk away with today.
Right.
If you don't get it, don't talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. Don't make shit up.
No, it's okay. We're all good. All right. I want to thank you so much for spending your time with us today. I really appreciate this. But before I let you go, I want to know where everybody can hang out with you on social media. And I want to hear just a little bit about your books.
Yeah, totally. Come catch me. I'm on Instagram, I am on Facebook, and I definitely am on TikTok, which I really, really have been enjoying lately, and I'm posting there, trying to at least daily. So please come catch my little random science tidbits. My books are going to be, let's see, my next upcoming release is the second book in the Coincidence Makers series. It's about people that make coincidences happen and how those really actually aren't necessarily coincidences. So they take place in San Francisco, which is close to where I grew up, and absolutely, some fun times, a little bit of suspense, a little bit of scariness, and a whole lot of adventure. So, my upcoming release is In Defiance of Fate. It is going to be the sequel to The Coincidence Makers. I also have Someone Else's Soul that came out a couple of years ago, and that is having to do with cloning for anybody who wants to read a little bit more about that and the effects of nature versus nurture. So one of my favorite topics. So it became a book. But yeah, the In Defiance of Fate. Definitely check that out at the end of March.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for hanging out with us, Meredith. This has been so much fun. I cannot wait to have you back. For those of you that don't know, she's definitely helping me with a book right now. I'm very excited about it. So we are going to make sure that we have more resources for you. Speaking of which, we've got a brand new episode of Experts for Authors this Wednesday. So 2 days from now, on February 3rd, 7 p.m. Eastern, we are hanging out with Airline Captain David Root. He was supposed to be last week, but he got called in to fly. So we bumped it to this week. We're so excited to hang out with him. He's going to talk all things pilot life for us and get your questions answered. So make sure that you are bringing your author friends into the author group on Facebook. We'll link that down for you below if you're on the replay. And we will see you for our next live stream in just a couple of days. Until then, hope you all have a fantastic day and stay inspired. Bye, friends.